Hello and welcome to Popular Antiquarian, the podcast about a middle-aged man exploring the strange and forgotten corners of pop culture. That middle-aged man is me, Hieronymus J. Doom, and this is another episode continuing our deep dive into Mystic Knights of Tir na Nog, the faintly baffling kids' fantasy adventure show set in pretend Ireland. In the last couple of episodes, we saw the knights finally and disappointingly tame the dragon Pyre, and also see off the latest invasion of the Kingdom of Kells by Queen Maeve and her bravery-impaired army. Now Deidre, Ivar, Angus and Rohan have only one thing on their mind: finding the ancient warrior Draganta, who is prophesied to restore peace to the land, uphold justice and provide sausage rolls for all. Traditionally, episodes of Mystic Knights open with a battle, but with the forces of evil reeling from their defeat in the last instalment, the writers have wisely decided to mix things up a bit. So we open in the castle of Kells with Deidre, Ivar and Angus stood on the battlements wondering where Rohan is and indulging in their favourite pastime of recapping previous events. Aideen, the inexplicably horny fairy, pops up to say Rohan is probably hanging out with a dragon. She frames this with an air of jealousy that vaguely implies that she thinks Rohan is trying to sleep with a dragon, which is a concerning and potentially life-threatening kink if true. I'm not sure I'd be comfortable with a sexual partner who could accidentally set fire to me at a moment of high passion, though I know myself well enough to recognise that I probably still would if I had a few drinks inside me and I was going through a dry spell. Given that there's only 4 actual women in Kells, and one of them is Deidre, who might actually be more furious than the dragon, I'm not going to judge Rohan too harshly. The knights head off to find Rohan by following a plume of smoke, which allows Angus to quip that where there's smoke, there's pyre, to withering scorn from Deidre. The writers then do something that really winds me up, which is to have Angus defensively explain the joke and say that he thinks it's funny as Deidre and Ivar stride off. The cadence of this is all off. When someone tells an awful dad joke, the correct response is to react as if the joke teller just drop-kicked a puppy. That reaction is almost the actual punchline. Someone tells an absolute howler and you respond by saying you want to attack them with a stick. The end. What you don't do is then talk about the joke ever again. Extra dialogue adds nothing and destroys the rhythm of the joke and its response. It's something I notice happens a lot in TV adverts that are trying to be funny. They'll have the advert crescendo with a gag, which leads into the sales pitch, and then they'll try and sneak in another, usually much weaker gag at the last minute, which has the effect of undercutting both the first gag and the sales pitch. There are ways of subverting the process that are satisfying. The comedian Stuart Lee will sometimes do a weak punchline and then explain in laborious detail the mechanics of the joke he's just told and why it should have got a bigger laugh. It works for him because the comedy then derives from his stage persona being that of a self-consciously erudite comedian who blames the audience for failing to fully appreciate his genius. In general, though, structure matters, and having Angus try and defend his terrible gag completely ruins the already limited impact of this exchange with Deidre. Anyway, we need to crack on, and that means it's time to check in with the villains. Queen Maeve is busy lecturing the 4 evil sentinels and her general talk on the current state of affairs. It's clear things are not going especially well, what with the Mystic Knights having obtained their weapons, their magic armour, and the services of an apparently sexually desirable dragon. She's on the back foot, and she's very concerned about the possibility that the Mystic Knights may find the warrior Draganta and scupper forever her chances of seizing control of Kells. Torque reckons everything is going to be absolutely fine because in order to find Draganta, legend holds that fire must reveal the secret sign, and that's hardly likely to happen. Put a pin in that because we're shortly going to be invited to consider what the smallest possible unit of foreshadowing might be. To her credit, Maeve doesn't buy into Torque's unwarranted optimism and warns him not to underestimate the group of teenagers who have repeatedly defeated him. We now turn to the Sentinels and a baffling bit of business involving a wager. Maeve says that she has a bet on with Torque over whether or not the Sentinels could defeat the warrior Draganta. According to Maeve, Torque reckons they can, but she reckons they can't. This appears to be news to Torque. This is obviously some kind of psychological trick to get the Sentinels to go after the warrior Draganta, and it's one they fall for hook, line and sinker, enthusiastically declaring that they're going to take out Draganta and win the bet for Torque. What's less clear is why this scheme of Maeve's is even slightly necessary. While the Sentinels technically work for Maida and not Maeve, the Dark Elf is absolutely not a fan of the Mystic Knights and has seemed deeply opposed to anything that makes the world a better place, much like the director of programming at Channel 5. One would assume that Maida and the Sentinels themselves would be totally on board with the idea of taking out Draganta without the need to resort to any kind of elaborate subterfuge. I sort of assumed that this was going to be done in order to set up a gag later where the Sentinels would return to Temra Castle at the end and go, "Queen Maeve, we bring you good news. You've defeated the warrior Draganta? No, he kicked the shit out of us, but on the upside, you've won your bet." In reality, of course, this bet will never be mentioned again, which makes it even more mystifying as a plot device. We now return to the Knights, where Ivar, Deidre and Angus have caught up with Rohan, who is busy doing something unspecified and possibly unspeakable with Pyre the Dragon, while Kahad the Druid watches on. Kahad certainly seems impressed with whatever it was Rohan was doing, maybe even a little too impressed. Deidre is not impressed. In general, but also specifically with Rohan. She wants to focus on the important matters at hand, specifically Draganta. At the mention of the name, Draganta, Pyre suddenly rears up and incinerates a patch of grass. On closer inspection, he's charred a half-assed sigil on the ground. A half-assed sigil that is an exact match for the weird birthmark on Rowan's arm, which was mentioned way back in episode 1. "Fire reveals the secret sign," murmurs Kahad in awe, a good 90 seconds after Torque mentioned it in the last scene, and bringing us to the question of what is the smallest possible gap between a thing being said and a thing happening for it to qualify as foreshadowing. There's a gag you can do where a character makes a prediction and then you immediately smash cut to evidence of that prediction being wrong. It's a common technique in sitcoms where a character will insist that there's no way that they would do something ridiculous, and then the very next shot is them already in the process of doing the ridiculous thing. "There's no way you're going to get me to dress up as a clown and romance that horse just so that you can get the big promotion at work," someone says, to be followed immediately by the unhappy character in a clown costume nervously approaching a horse with a bottle of wine and a box of chocolates while the rest of the cast look on. If they'd done that and smash cut from Torque confidently proclaiming the Knights had no chance of revealing the secret sign to Pyre doing his underwhelming street art, that would have more or less landed, because the gag here is that the thing that's supposed to be very hard turns out to be very, very easy. If they'd done it at the end of the episode, ideally somewhere that Maeve and Torque could see it, then they could have done it as a callback to the prediction, and that would have qualified as foreshadowing. 90 seconds is too long for it to qualify as a cutaway gag, and far too short to qualify as actual foreshadowing. I'd go so far as to venture that 90 seconds might be the worst possible amount of time to have picked, which almost makes it art. I'd be lying if I didn't confess to getting a terrible sinking feeling in my stomach when it became clear that the secret sign was the same as Rowan's birthmark. That sinking feeling turned out to be bang on the money, because Kahad almost immediately announces that this means that Rohan is in fact the warrior Draganta. This is a disappointment on the level of discovering that you've accidentally booked Andrew Mountbatten Windsor instead of a magician for your child's birthday party. It's not just my personal and completely justified antipathy towards Rohan that's behind my outrage. It's mostly that, sure, maybe even almost all of that, but it is also just kind of infuriating storytelling. We'll set aside that there's wooden chairs in Kel's castle I'd prefer to see as the chosen one in this story, and look at the very odd decision to have Draganta randomly revealed 5 minutes into the episode after building the character up for the last 8 episodes. One of the things I like about Mystic Knights of Tir na Nog is that there is this ongoing narrative which has been building quite nicely since the start of the show. By all rights, the quest for Draganta should have been a real high point, the culmination of some apocalyptic showdown, a reveal made at the moment when all seemed lost. Instead, it's just some plank of a man looking at a squiggle in a field, a squiggle that looks like someone failed to draw the Coca-Cola logo while on ketamine. There's a bit of me that hopes this is all going to be some kind of elaborate fake-out, that Rohan is connected with Draganta, but not actually Draganta, and that I'm still going to get my set-piece Draganta reveal at some point down the line. I realise that this puts me in the same category as the slash writers who convinced themselves that the last episode of Sherlock was terrible on purpose, and that there was going to be a special secret final episode that would magically make the last one become good somehow, but still I cling to a tiny shred of hope regardless, because this reveal, on the face of it, completely sucks. I'm not the only one surprised and disappointed by the big reveal. Back at Kel's castle, Cahad is explaining to King Conovar that Rohan is the warrior Draganta, and Conovar looks like a cat has just thrown up on his sugar puffs and immediately asks if Cahad is sure. Cahad insists that yes, he is sure, and Conovar states that under no circumstances must Queen Maeve learn that Rohan is Draganta. This time they do the cutaway right, because we immediately go to Maeve saying, "Rohan, the warrior Draganta," and also doing a face like a cat has thrown up on her sugar puffs, which is a nice bit of parallelism. Torque confirms that his spies observed the business with the dragon, and also says that rather than rally round their new leader, the Mystic Knights seem to be quarrelling. Seems like almost no one is happy about this new situation. We now get some evidence of the knights being at loggerheads as we cut to a village in the one and only village in all of Kells. Aideen the fairy bucks the trend by being delighted because she's very horny for Rohan, but Angus seems pretty bitter and Deidre is actually too confused to be angry about it at all. Ivar seems more chill about it, but technically being a Mystic Knight is only a side hustle for a man who is the prince of a completely different kingdom, so that's understandable. Tempers flare and it seems like Rohan is going to storm off in a huff, except that it then becomes clear he actually expects everyone else to storm off and leave him to think alone in his hovel. As soon as the rest have stormed off, Rohan sits alone with his thoughts for approximately 4 seconds before also leaving. I'm guessing he didn't have very many thoughts to be alone with. Aideen tries to follow him, but Rohan brushes her off and tells her that he's off to see King Finvara of Tir na Nog. We cut back to Queen Maeve and Torque. She's musing on the corrosive nature of distrust upon friendship, and declares that at last she's found a chink in the magical armour of the Mystic Knights. She casts a spell to amplify their resentments, and tells General Torque to be on the lookout for disillusioned knights. This is a cracking scene. Maeve and Torque always have excellent chemistry, and I like how Maeve shows awareness that she's going to have to try a different tack to defeat the knights. It's something fresh, and it plays on the fact that the series has clearly established that the Mystic Knights do have a tendency to bicker among themselves. It's well set up, and the spell feels like a genuine threat. Turning the heroes' worst traits against themselves is a trope I really like, because it's always firmly rooted in the characters. It's a cool premise, and the script does a good job showing Maeve realising that there's a possibility of an approach the Knights will never see coming. Charlotte Bradley and Jerry O'Brien deliver the lines with gusto, and it is a high spot in a story that's been distinctly undercooked thus far. We now need the obligatory scene of the spell taking effect. First we see Ivar, Angus and Deidre united in their disdain for Rohan, and then there's a bit of flashy green light and they're suddenly at each other's throats. All 3 actors do a good job here, although the script does get a bit muddled. Angus leads off by suddenly announcing that he should be Draganta, which doesn't impress Ivar at all. He claims that he could best both Deidre and Angus, which causes Deidre to play the royalty card and claim that if anyone should lead the group, it's her. Technically, Ivar is also royalty, but the script quite often forgets this. Angus takes the opportunity for a little casual misogyny, which leads to Deidre challenging into a fight. This is the big misstep because they clearly aren't going to fight, and the rest of the scene is basically walking this threat back. Don't threaten me with a good time, then chicken out. The scene ends with all three storming off in a huff under the influence of Maeve's spell. Rohan, being the specialist boy that there ever was, is unaffected, of course. We can't have Rohan behaving like an actual human being in case he accidentally becomes relatable. As if to underline how relatable he isn't, he's about to go to Tir na Nog on purpose, which does lead to one of my favourite moments in the episode because he winds up surprising King Finvara when he's about to tuck into a gigantic wedding cake. This is a great visual, just a mad old man with a cake that's larger than his head. Not a bit larger either, it's considerably larger, and no reason whatsoever is given or indeed needed. He's an elderly lunatic, and that is reason enough. Rohan does the thing where the Chosen One tries to act humble by claiming that it's impossible that they're the Chosen One. Finvara insists that Rohan is definitely the Chosen One, and tells him to piss off so he can finish his pudding, dropping a vague hint that the other Mystic Knights are in trouble as he does so. Rohan leaves at once, leaving Finvara eyeing his cake in a way that ought to get him put on a list. I'm certain he's going to do more than just tuck into that giant cake. In another classic display of adequate storytelling, we cut straight to Deidre being captured by the forces of Temra. This scene accomplishes two things. Firstly, it's a nicely staged ambush with the villains suddenly popping up out of piles of leaves and grabbing the princess. Secondly, it gives Jerry O'Brien a chance to show off his malevolent chuckling skills, which are strong. Deidre is taken to an outpost near the border of Temra, where they have sensibly bound and gagged her in order to prevent her from summoning her magical armour. They chuck her into a stockade, and actress Lisa Dwan takes advantage of being gagged to make it clear that Deidre is swearing her head off. Once she's done impotently yelling and kicking the gate, she realises she's not alone. Ivar has also been taken. They lock eyes for a moment, and then slump down to pointedly sulk at each other, which establishes that Maeve's spell is still very much in effect. Despite the slow start and the weird structure, this episode is beginning to take shape quite nicely. We've got some solid peril with an underlying problem that needs to be fixed. It's a bit muddled. We've broadly forgotten about the Sentinels for some reason, but I'm enjoying seeing the Knights face a different kind of challenge. There is still one angry knight unaccounted for in the shape of Angus, who is busy collecting a few things from his hut while muttering darkly about how much he hates everyone and everything. Doing small chores in a state of pointless fury at the world is probably the second most relatable thing anyone in this show has ever done. Rohan interrupts him with a view to dealing with the danger, and Angus responds by trying to beat the shit out of him, which is the most relatable thing anyone in this show has ever done. The fight that results is mostly grabbing and shoving, and is arguably the most realistic fight in the show so far, in that it wouldn't be out of place in any junior school playground anywhere in the world. Rohan cleverly works out that Angus is bewitched when Aideen pops up to say that Angus is bewitched, and he cleverly works out that water will break the spell when Aideen also tells him that water will break the spell. Rohan shoves Angus into a water trough, which gives us a classic Angus pratfall for the episode, and the spell is duly broken. It's not quite as funny as the running gag where things set Angus's trousers on fire, but there's still something amusing about a man falling into a trough full of water. My favourite bit of the scene is when Angus clambers out of the trough and proceeds to shake himself violently like a wet dog. It's a great bit of physical comedy and entirely appropriate for the character. I do think this sequence shows the writer's lack of familiarity with actual Ireland though, because any spell that can be broken by getting wet is going to be lucky to last out the day in famously rainy Ireland. It would be like casting a spell in England that can be broken by going into a Greggs. Still, having soused his best friend, the spell is broken, and Angus and Rohan can get on with the business of saving Ivar and Deidre. We're heading into the home stretch, and that means it's time to check in with Queen Maeve. Torque delivers the good news that Ivar and Deidre have been captured, and Maeve immediately thinks it's time to start another war. She absolutely loves starting wars. Her triumph is interrupted when the writers remember that the Sentinels are a thing and have them barge in to announce that they've searched the entire island and failed to find the warrior Draganta. This is presumably a lie, since if they'd searched the entire island, they'd have definitely looked in Kel's one and only village. I can only assume they got bored halfway through and decided to go to the pub. The sentinels do move as though they've had a couple of pints with a pub lunch. There's a slightly mal-coordinated quality to them, or big gestures and just a hint of being unsteady on their pins. Maeve tells them to search along the Kells-Temra border, and the fact that they don't immediately counter by saying they've already done that adds further weight to my boozy lunch theory. Rohan and Angus head over the beautiful Irish countryside to the outpost where Ivar and Deidre are being held, and Rohan tells Aideen to go and find them and douse them with water, which fills her with understandable delight. Who among us wouldn't enjoy saving the day by soaking a pair of faintly irritating teenagers? As soon as she's dispatched, Rohan and Angus are ambushed by the 4 sentinels in what might be the first example of the sentinels competently ambushing someone we've seen in the show thus far, in that they do actually appear from nowhere, rather than saying they're going to do an ambush and then running directly at the Mystic Knights yelling at the top of their voice. This is our cue for a proper fight, and it's actually a cut above. The fights between the Sentinels and the Mystic Knights have been very slow and cumbersome, but this one has a real zip to it. A lot of this is down to the direction and editing, which is much tighter than we've seen. There's more close-ups and the use of Dutch angles, and the shot length has been trimmed down to just hit the high points of each move, and it delivers an actual sense of urgency. And it is astonishing how much of a difference it makes. Even the obligatory shooting lasers feels exciting because of how tightly the shot has been composed. Seeing it done wrong so many times has been really instructive because it sharpens my understanding of how fight scenes on screen work when done right. Getting the camera much closer to the action makes the whole thing feel more kinetic, and the fact that you can't see everything that's happening draws your attention to the actual beats of the fight whilst creating a sense of confusion and danger. It's not perfect by any means. Angus doesn't get involved for some reason, leaving Rohan to face the Sentinels alone, and the fight finishes with a long-range shot that does highlight that this is still 4 men in silly clothes standing near each other in a field, but it is a step up, and seeing Rohan bravely facing 4 foes at once does provide some evidence that he may indeed be the warrior Draganta. With Rohan hard pressed by the Sentinels, we turn our attention to Ivar and Deidre, who are still bound and gagged in the stockade. They are sat back to back, still sulking furiously and elbowing each other in the ribs to pass the time. Aideen flits in, and it's at this point I notice that there's been a pail of water suspended on a string above the quarrelsome knights for the entire time they've been sat in the stockade. Sure enough, Aideen uses her magic to cause the pail of water to upend itself over Ivar and Deidre and release them from the spell. She also frees them from their bonds and returns their magical weapons to them so they can armour up and escape captivity in order to help Rohan, who is still fighting alone outside the outpost against all 4 sentinels because Angus doesn't feel like helping for reasons that are never explained. One of the things that happens when I do a deep dive into something is that sooner or later I start to feel like I'm going mad. Often the moment I begin to go a little strange is only obvious to me in retrospect, but with the Mystic Knights of Tir na Nog, I'm fortunate that I can point to the exact moment that I felt my grip on reality becoming gently untethered. It was the very moment I noticed that pail of water dangling on a string. My life is now divided into 2 distinct eras, the pre- and post-bucket on a string eras. I am no longer the same person I once was. Much of my waking life is now devoted to 2 simple questions. Who decided to hang a bucket of water on a string over the stockade, and more importantly, why? On one level, I know the answer to both of these questions. It was the writers who decided to hang the bucket on a string, and they did it so that there was a largest source of water conveniently placed so that Aideen could tip it over Deidre and Ivar, and thus release them from the spell. Aideen is tiny, possibly even smaller than your dad's penis, and thus her options for physically dousing someone with water are limited. I wouldn't be surprised if the original draft of the script called for her to physically tip the bucket rather than use her magic, but the production team felt that it would have been too difficult to actually stage on screen, hence they simplified it so that she uses magic, which means less faffing about with some green screens and constructing prop buckets the size of an adult woman for her to interact with. From a production perspective, it all makes sense. What I can't grasp is how the bucket on a string came to be there within the fictional world presented by the show. Within the story, someone at some point must have filled a bucket with water and attached it to the string. It's quite high up, and a bucket of water is quite heavy, so the hypothetical bucket dangler, who we will call Old Man Bucket, must have gone to some little trouble to put it there. Possibly the string was already in situ, and if that's the case, Old Man Bucket would have needed some kind of stepladder in order to attach the bucket to the string. In this scenario, Old Man Bucket, armed with a full pail of water, clambers up a stepladder and attaches the full bucket to the string. Alternatively, and more plausibly, Old Man Bucket began by attaching the string to the bucket. He then went up onto the battlements, secured the other end of the string to something up there, and very carefully lowered the bucket down until the string was taut, leaving the bucket of water safely suspended above the stockade. Either scenario involves a degree of care on the part of Old Man Bucket. This is not something that can have happened by chance. Old Man Bucket wanted to suspend a bucket on a string over the stockade. We have some idea of how, but we're no closer to learning why. This is, I think, one of the great unknowable questions in literature. At the end of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the tyrannical Mr. Kurtz's final words are the cryptic phrase, "the horror, the horror," which are often read as a reflection on the utter moral and spiritual decay the character has undergone in the Belgian Congo. Yet they defy simple explanation. They are ambiguous and frightening words. Yet for me they are overshadowed by the much more chilling question of the motives of Old Man Bucket when he went to such trouble in order to suspend a bucket of water on a string over a stockade. I can't shake the feeling that somewhere in this lonely outpost on a hill there is someone undergoing a profound and terrifying mental collapse. I have chosen to give that person a name, Old Man Bucket, because in doing so I can attempt to circumscribe the unknowable. Yet for all I know, it wasn't one person, but many. The bucket may be a symptom of a corporate insanity, a group of soldiers driven mad by the pressure of Queen Maeve's ceaseless wars against Temra to the extent that they feel compelled to suspend vessels of water in hard-to-reach places. Perhaps within the outpost there are many water-filled buckets suspended from strings. We can never know, and in that absence I am forced to confront a hard truth, that we can never truly inhabit the mind of another human being. What I am certain of is that there is a gnawing insanity somewhere in the world of Pretend Island, and perhaps King Finvara of Tir na Nog is merely one example among many who have been fundamentally broken. Perhaps it was King Finvara who put the bucket there, but I have to try and stop speculating now, or I'll start to lose the threads of my own reason. The most important thing is that I'm going mad. The second most important thing is that Deidre and Ivar break free from the stockade and fight their way out of the outpost in order to go to the aid of Rohan, who is locked in combat with the Sentinels. With Ivar and Deidre joining the fray, Angus finally wakes up and also runs to help, and between them, the mystical knights see off their foes. Looks like Queen Maeve has won the bet after all. The Sentinels couldn't defeat Draganta even when it was 4 against 1. Somehow they get worse at fighting every single time they try, which is a bit like me playing darts. Deidre apologises for ever doubting Rohan, and Rohan, rather smugly for my money, accepts her apology and says he doubted himself. There's a little coda in which Rohan tells King Conovar that although Draganta is a warrior, he is also a mystic knight, and that they can only defeat Maeve by working together, and that is a wrap on the episode. It's an odd one. The whole thing with Queen Maeve's wager barely figures in the plot, and while I do very much like the business with her sorcery turning the knights against each other, it's hard not to see the incredibly sudden reveal that Rohan is Draganta as a bit of a damp squib. It feels like two stories that have been rather uncomfortably mashed together in a way that doesn't quite serve the demands of either narrative strand, but there's some good fun to be had along the way. And I'd much rather a show tried to do too much than too little, which is the bane of modern long-form television. Sure, I've been condemned to spend the rest of my life thinking about a bucket on a string, but that is a small price to pay for being entertained for a solid 20 minutes. Or at least, I think it is. I just have to resist the urge to pivot this podcast into a 50-part series in which I try and fail to come up with a sane reason for that bucket on a string being there. That is all for this instalment of Popular Antiquarian. If you want to support my ongoing descent into madness financially, you can do so by going to patreon.com/HJDoom and pledging as little as a single quid to support this nonsense. Helps keep the podcast on the air and ad-free, and all supporters receive a whole bevy of gaming materials that I've written over the years. Any and all support is gratefully received. Even a quid makes a massive difference to me because I am poor. You can get in touch with me via email at hjdoomretrofun, or one word, at gmail.com, or by following me on Blue Sky at hjdoom. Thank you very much for listening. Take care, and I'll see you soon.